You are, by a wide margin, the smartest person in almost every room you enter. Nobody in those rooms has ever once heard you say that sentence out loud. This is the story of exactly why you decided, years ago, to stay quiet about it. It was not fear, and it was not modesty either. It was something closer to a strategy. In school, you finished tests early and still never raised your hand to answer questions. A teacher once pulled you aside, curious why you scored highest but spoke the least. You told her you just liked listening more than talking, which was only half true. The other half was that answers, once spoken, invited attention you never really wanted. Classmates who spoke up got praised loudly, then quietly resented by half the room. You preferred being underestimated, it turned out, to being watched that closely by anyone. A school competition once placed you first without you ever mentioning you had even entered. Your parents found out from the mailed certificate, not from anything you had told them yourself. They asked why you had not said anything, and you honestly were not sure how to answer that. By 16, the habit had already hardened into something closer to a personality trait. A guidance counselor once flagged you for a gifted program you had never applied to yourself. You attended 2 sessions, found them mildly interesting, and quietly stopped going after that. Being labeled gifted felt like exactly the kind of attention you had spent years avoiding. Nobody pushed you to continue, and the label quietly faded from anyone's memory within a semester. Your first real job interview tested exactly how far that habit would actually stretch. The interviewer asked a technical question 3 other candidates had reportedly gotten completely wrong. You answered it correctly, but simply, without showing off the deeper reasoning behind it. The interviewer nodded, satisfied, and moved on without probing any further into your answer. You got the job, quietly, without anyone in that room realizing how much you had held back. Holding back was not dishonesty, you told yourself. It was simply answering only what was asked. Nobody hires someone for being unteachable, and showing everything too early can look exactly like that. Your first month on the job, you deliberately asked more questions than you strictly needed to. Appearing to still be learning bought you time nobody thought to watch very closely. You used that time to actually understand the systems most new hires only pretended to grasp. By the 3rd month, you understood the entire workflow better than colleagues who had been there for years. You never mentioned that, and continued asking the same simple, unassuming questions in meetings. In meetings, you learned to speak only when a direct question landed specifically on you. Other people filled silences with half-formed ideas, competing loudly for the same small window. You watched the pattern for months before you understood exactly what it was protecting. Loud ideas got remembered, right or wrong, simply because they filled the most airtime. Quiet, correct ideas, offered once, usually got noticed by exactly one person in the room. You decided early that one right person noticing was worth more than 10 people forgetting, so you kept your contributions short, specific, and almost embarrassingly easy to miss entirely. A junior analyst once thanked you privately for the one clear sentence that actually helped her. You told her she was welcome, and quietly filed the moment away as proof the habit worked. Over time, a small handful of coworkers learned to specifically seek out your quiet input. They rarely said why, but they came back again and again whenever something actually mattered. You never advertised that reputation. It simply spread the same quiet way everything else about you did. A senior colleague once presented a flawed projection model to the entire department, confidently. You spotted the error within the first 2 minutes, a formula referencing the wrong column entirely. You said nothing, and watched the presentation continue confidently for another 20 minutes straight. Afterward, you mentioned the error privately, gently, in a short email nobody else ever saw. The colleague thanked you quietly and corrected the model before anyone higher up ever noticed. You could have corrected it publicly and looked sharp in front of the entire department instead. Public correction would have cost the colleague something and gained you very little in return. A few weeks later, that same colleague quietly started running numbers past you before meetings. Neither of you ever mentioned the earlier email again. It simply became how the two of you worked. Word never spread about the incident, and you preferred it precisely that way every single time. A pattern was forming, quiet corrections instead of public ones, spread across nearly 2 years now. A new manager joined the team that year, sharp, observant, and unusually difficult to read. She started asking pointed questions in meetings, watching closely for who actually understood the material. You answered only when asked directly, brief and precise, the same habit as always before. After the third meeting, she started directing the hardest questions specifically toward you first. You realized, slowly, that she had noticed exactly what most people in the room missed. She never said it outright, but her questions started carrying a different kind of weight. Being seen by one sharp person felt different than being seen by an entire loud room. She started scheduling short one-on-one check-ins, always with sharper questions than the group meetings ever had. You answered honestly in those smaller rooms, in ways you rarely allowed yourself in larger ones. She once asked directly why you never spoke up in the bigger group the way you did with her. You gave an honest but incomplete answer, not quite ready to explain the whole habit yet. She did not push further, but you noticed she remembered the question longer than most people would. That small moment stayed with you longer than you expected, a rare crack in a very old habit. A company-wide trivia event happened that spring, casual, low stakes, meant purely for fun. You answered almost every question correctly before catching yourself and deliberately slowing down. A coworker joked loudly that you should just be on the trivia team professionally. You laughed it off, missed the next two questions on purpose, and let someone else win. The near miss reminded you exactly how easily the habit could slip without careful attention. You tightened the habit again afterward, the same way you always had after a close call. Trivia nights, it turned out, were more dangerous to the habit than most actual work meetings. You noticed afterward how much easier it was to hide inside actual work than inside games. Work had structure and stakes, games had neither, and stakes, you realized, were easier to hide behind. You skipped the next few trivia nights entirely, choosing quiet apartment evenings over the risk instead. Nobody seemed to mind your absence, and the habit stayed exactly as protected as it needed to be. A confident new hire assumed, based on your quiet meetings, that you were simply not very sharp. He corrected you once in front of others, loudly, on a point you actually understood better. You let the correction stand, nodded, and said nothing further about the actual facts involved. He grew more confident after that, correcting you again in 2 more meetings that same month. Eventually, a project failed specifically because of the exact point he had confidently overridden. Nobody connected the failure back to that earlier meeting, and you never brought it up either. Being right quietly, you had learned, mattered more to you than being right loudly ever would. The confident coworker eventually transferred to another department, still believing his version of events completely. You wished him well, genuinely, and never once felt the need to correct the record. Months later, he sent a short message admitting he had underestimated you badly during that whole stretch. You replied graciously, and meant it, holding no real resentment over any of it by then. The exchange reminded you that most people underestimate quiet people out of habit, not malice. You had stopped taking it personally years earlier, and that shift alone had made things easier. A company all-hands meeting opened the floor for anyone to present new ideas publicly. You had a genuinely strong idea, one you had quietly refined in your head for months. For a moment, you considered standing up and presenting it to the entire room directly. You pictured the applause, the recognition, and also the sudden weight of everyone's attention afterward. You sat back down instead, and wrote the idea into a short email to your manager privately. She read it that same week, understood it immediately, and quietly began building it into the roadmap. The idea moved forward exactly the way you wanted, just without your name attached to the applause. A few colleagues later praised the idea in a meeting, unaware it had started as your private email. You clapped along with everyone else, and felt something closer to relief than any real disappointment. A year later, the manager was promoted, and she requested you specifically for her new team. In the interview for the transfer, she told the panel exactly why she wanted you there. You were, she said plainly, the most reliable person in any room she had ever managed. Nobody on the panel had ever heard you say more than a few sentences in any meeting. That contradiction, more than anything else, seemed to convince them faster than any speech could have. You got the transfer, the raise attached to it, and never once had to raise your voice. The habit that once felt like hiding had quietly become the exact reason people trusted you. Old classmates occasionally reached out online, surprised to see how far your quiet career had gone. You replied briefly, politely, and closed the laptop without dwelling on it much further. A family member asked at dinner that year exactly what your new title actually meant. You explained it simply, without listing the reasons behind the promotion in any real detail. They seemed satisfied with the short version, the same way most people usually were. Your father asked one more question later, quietly, once the rest of the table had moved on. He wanted to know if you were actually happy, not just successful, and you told him honestly you were. A senior role opened up that year, and a loud, ambitious colleague campaigned hard for it. He mentioned his own achievements constantly, in meetings, in hallways, in almost every conversation available. You said nothing about your own record, the same habit you had carried since childhood. Co-workers began quietly comparing the two of you, though rarely within earshot of either of you. The decision, when it finally came, surprised almost everyone in the department except your manager. She told you privately that loud confidence had never once been what she was actually measuring. The rival took the news graciously, mostly, and asked you afterward what he had missed. You told him honestly, consistency mattered more over time than any single loud moment ever could. He seemed to take the advice seriously, and you noticed him speak up less in meetings after that. It was not imitation exactly, more like a small recalibration you recognized from your own past. Months into the new team, a critical system failure hit during a major client presentation. Panic moved through the room fast, everyone talking over each other trying to find the cause. You had noticed the exact vulnerability 3 weeks earlier, and quietly flagged it in a low-priority ticket. Nobody had read it, buried under dozens of other tickets marked with the same routine priority. You pulled up the ticket calmly, in the middle of the panic, and pointed everyone toward it. The fix took 11 minutes once everyone finally understood exactly where to look for it. The client never even noticed the disruption, and the room slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Someone asked, afterward, how you had known to flag it 3 full weeks before it broke. You said you just noticed something small, and left the explanation exactly that short again. The team lead wrote a short incident report afterward, crediting the early flag without much detail. You read it later, quietly satisfied that the credit existed somewhere even if nobody discussed it. The manager started assigning you newer analysts to mentor, quietly, one at a time each quarter. You taught the way you had always operated, small clear answers instead of long confident speeches. One analyst asked why you never seemed to want credit for anything you actually did well. You told her credit was fine, but being useful mattered to you considerably more than credit did. She remembered that answer for years afterward, longer than she remembered almost anything else you taught her. Watching her grow more confident felt better, somehow, than any personal recognition ever had before. You never told her that directly, though you suspected she had already figured it out herself. A second analyst joined your informal mentoring circle the following quarter, eager and slightly nervous. You taught him the same way, small answers, real patience, no pressure to perform quickly. Within months, both analysts had quietly become 2 of the most reliable people on the floor. A regional conference invited speakers that year, and your manager quietly nominated your name. You almost declined immediately, the old instinct rising fast before you could fully think it through. Instead, you proposed a compromise, a short technical workshop instead of a full keynote speech. The organizers agreed, and the workshop room ended up smaller, quieter, and considerably more focused. You taught for 40 minutes, answered questions precisely, and left before anyone could ask for photos. One attendee later wrote a short thank you email, saying it was the most useful session all week. You printed nothing, posted nothing, and told almost nobody at work that it had happened at all. Months later, the organizers invited you back for a larger session, and you declined politely again. 1 workshop a year, small and quiet, felt like exactly the right amount for you. A recruiter from a competing company reached out directly, having heard about you through back channels. The offer was generous, flattering, and would have required exactly the kind of visibility you avoided. You took the call out of curiosity, and asked more questions than you actually answered yourself. The recruiter seemed surprised by how little you wanted to talk about your own accomplishments. You declined politely in the end, choosing the quiet team you already trusted over the unknown spotlight. Your manager never knew about the offer, and you never felt the need to mention it either. Some decisions, you had learned, were easier to make when nobody else was watching you make them. The recruiter followed up once more a month later, and you declined a second time briefly. This time there was no hesitation at all. The decision had already fully settled inside you. A university reached out that fall, asking if you would join a career panel for graduating students. You agreed on the condition that the panel stay small, informal, and free of any recorded video. A dozen students showed up, nervous, eager, asking the kind of questions you once had yourself. One student asked directly how to get noticed at a first job without feeling arrogant about it. You told her getting noticed and being loud were not actually the same skill at all. Being useful consistently, you explained, eventually gets noticed by exactly the people who matter most. A few students looked skeptical, the same way you probably would have at their exact age. You did not try to convince them further. Some lessons, you knew, only land years later anyway. One student stayed behind after the panel, asking quietly if the quiet approach ever got lonely. You told her honestly that it sometimes did, but rarely enough to make you want to change it. She thanked you for the honest answer, and you walked out into the evening feeling oddly lighter. Back at work, an annual review cycle arrived, the same structured process it always was. Your manager read through a list of contributions you had almost entirely forgotten you had made. Hearing them listed out loud felt strange, like hearing a stranger's year described in careful detail. She rated you at the highest tier available, and asked if you had any concerns about it. You said no, genuinely, though some quiet part of you still felt uncertain about accepting it fully. She smiled, said that was exactly the reaction she expected, and moved on to the next topic. Walking out of that review, you felt less triumphant than simply, quietly, confirmed in something old. The raise attached to the review landed in your account the same automatic, unremarkable way it always did. You did not celebrate, did not announce it, just noted it quietly and continued with the rest of your evening. A close friend outside of work once asked bluntly why you never talked about your job. You gave your usual short answer, and she pushed back harder than most people ever did. She said she would notice the pattern for years, and finally wanted an honest answer about it. You told her the truth, slowly, about the school tests and the meetings and the quiet habit. She listened without interrupting, the same patient way she listened to almost everything you said. When you finished, she simply said that made complete sense, and asked what you wanted for lunch. No further questions, no big reaction, just quiet acceptance from someone who had earned the honesty. You realized walking home that being fully known by one person mattered more than being known by many. Your friend texted later that night, just a short message saying she was glad you would finally told her. You smiled at the phone, replied briefly, and felt lighter than you had in a long while. A major client project landed on your desk that winter, complicated, high stakes, tightly scheduled. Two louder colleagues volunteered immediately for the visible leadership roles everyone would remember later. You volunteered for the unglamorous technical core, the part almost nobody would think to thank. Weeks of quiet work followed, careful, detailed, invisible to almost everyone outside your immediate team. When the project launched successfully, the two loud colleagues gave confident interviews about the process. Neither of them mentioned the technical core that had actually made the entire launch possible. Your manager mentioned it though, privately, in the same short email tradition you had always shared. That was enough. It always had been, one accurate sentence from someone who actually understood the work. A junior teammate on the project asked, quietly, how you dealt with never getting the public credit. You told her the credit that actually mattered had never once been the public kind anyway. She looked unconvinced, the same way you probably had at her exact stage of the career. You did not push the point further. Some lessons only really land after enough years pass. The project itself won a small internal award months later, presented at a short company gathering. Your name appeared on the award slide in smaller text, third from the bottom of the list. You clapped along with everyone else, and felt, once again, that familiar and comfortable kind of relief. That evening, you sat alone in your apartment, replaying the day the way you sometimes did. You did not feel unappreciated, exactly. You felt something quieter, harder to put into words. Somewhere at work, People still described you as quiet, careful, maybe a little hard to read. None of them were wrong exactly, they just were not seeing the full shape of the picture. You had built an entire career on being right quietly, one small unclaimed answer at a time. You thought about the analyst you had mentored, and the workshop room, and the review meeting. None of those moments had made you famous, and none of them had ever needed to. You thought, briefly, about the version of yourself who might have chosen differently at every stage. That version might have been louder, faster, more visible, and possibly just as successful in his own way. You did not envy him exactly, you just noticed the thought, and let it pass without much weight. Tomorrow you would walk into another meeting, and probably say very little again, same as always. Somebody in that room would eventually notice, the same way somebody always eventually did. And somewhere behind that ordinary quiet, the smartest person in the room kept saying nothing.